Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the technical alignment between the sustainability taxonomies we know and have, which are GRI, ESRS, and ISSB. And I will periodically lose my mouse, so bear with me. What's changed in 2024? Well, we have ESRS at version 1.0 and published to the public. We've also, earlier in the year, had ISSB published in 1.0. And around the same time as that, GRI published their draft for the consultation, and GRI's 1.0 release is expected at the end of this year, or by the end of this year. So 2024 is the year of the sustainability taxonomy, because we've gone from 0 to 2, and probably to 3. I think 3, right, Piers? Just into January, all right, nearly. So that is dramatic progress. But what are the similarities and the differences between these taxonomies? So the obvious one, which needs calling out up front, are the areas covered. ISSB has S1, which is the general disclosure and the cross-referencing. In many ways, it's what sets up all the other topic standards, of which there's one, S2, which is the climate-focused disclosure standard. But then ISSB also has a number of industry metrics. So if any of you have used SASB, this is the ongoing evolution from the SASB metrics. SASB is still there and parked in its own maintenance track, but the ideas from SASB were taken into the industry metrics through the ISSB standards process and are now in the ISSB taxonomy. Whereas ESRS and GRI have a number of topical standards, not just climate, but water and biodiversity in terms of environment, and obviously all the social topics and the governance topics. So all three expect reports to be done using inline XBRL, and that is music to my ears. But they are all standard setters, not regulators. So there is another layer of rules to come from the regulators. Final point on inline XBRL, we get the human readable and the machine readable. I know you all know it, but I like saying it. So, as regards entity extension taxonomies, slightly different approaches between the three. So ESRS has been designed with the view that an entity extension taxonomy, it's a real mouthful, should be optional. So existing ESEF filers already have an entity extension taxonomy to do their ESEF financial accounts, and they will likely incorporate the ESRS reporting into that. But we will have to wait for the RTS from ESMA to see what that means. But ESRS and CSRD extends way beyond existing ESEF filers. And so one of the things they've had to recognize there is they may not have, for example, accounts in XBRL. So they may not have an extension taxonomy already, so it needs to deal with that. ISSB is rather aligned to IASB, as you would hope. So it requires an entity extension taxonomy, and we will see why that is later. And GRI is equally firm, although Piers was wavering this morning, that entity extension taxonomies are prohibited. So they're all clear and slightly different, and I'm not sure it really matters from a technology point of view, but it does sometimes from a practical cost point of view. So I'm going to look at some of the technical areas of differences and similarities. I should stress there's more similarities than differences. It's better for me to pick on the differences or the things that people think are different and aren't. If we take emissions, they all collect Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. They're all numeric facts. They all use tons of CO2 equivalent from the unit type registry. So let's get started and look at narrative reporting. Well, they all use text blocks. We all know what a text block is. There's sort of roughly up to 3 levels. Occasionally you can find an extra level if you count really hard. The deepest level is often this thing, semi-narrative. So we've got all these different words going on, semi-narrative, categorical, booleans, extensible enumerations. But it's how do I make the data user-friendly, AI-friendly? Can a machine read this reliably rather than guessing what the text says? And we'll come on to see some examples on that. And then the other thing we've got going on, which is worth mentioning with the narratives, is this whole thing about block tagging and top-level text blocks. And ESRS is using a particular inline XBRL transform. I'll show an example in a minute, which makes the fact value empty. And you think, well, why would you want an empty tag? What would that mean? Well, it means there's no value there. So why would you do that? It's so you avoid repeating the same information in multiple facts. Because otherwise, because they nest, you just keep getting the same bit said again and again. Well, then why tag it? And there's two reasons. There's a good working group note on this. So the first thing is it's a disclosure indicator. So anyone doing analysis can search for that top-level tag and find it in all the reports. Whereas if you didn't tag it because you didn't think you needed to, then your filing wouldn't be included in whatever search someone had done. So that would be problematic. The other thing it's really good with helping for is navigation and highlighting within the reports. So most people know what the top-level disclosure is, disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. So if you click on that, it'll take you to the right section and you can see all the detailed tags. So it's this sort of trade-off between avoiding repetition, but also giving people the navigation they want. So this is where I lose my mouse, and I switch to examples and then try to switch back again. So this is a big tag around the whole block, and its little fact value there is dramatically empty because it's used exactly this transform, because it's saying everything in this block is in its own individual tags, so we don't want the big one. And you'll see that text there is, this text just where my mouse is not in another tag, but it's basically saying it's irrelevant. It's also in dodgy Latin because it's ESRS's samples, but we'll come on to some others. Whereas this one is an example of a semi-narrative, so lots of text for the humans to read, and the fact value, true. So again, the machine can write the search for it very well. And then down here, we've got a number buried as part of that disclosure. So it's all normal stuff. We can similarly look at health and safety metrics. So this is a big table of data, but the whole section has got this big empty tag around it. And that means you can jump to that section really quickly and then look at the actual interesting numbers underneath. So let's continue. In particular, let's continue as regards dimensions. Everyone's favorite thing. So they are a jargon-filled mess, dimensions, but actually they're quite simple, really. We're trying to disaggregate data to break it down. And the domain for a dimension is all the possible values for that dimension. And we've got two different types in XBRL, explicit and typed. And people have got quite hung up over this over the years, so I'm going to try and bring a little bit of clarity and just set out what they are so you can all go and tell everyone they're fine and they make sense. So within explicit dimensions, we have three different ways of looking at them. I've sort of limited it to these examples. The base taxonomy can define the domain. That makes sense for Scope 3 emissions categories. They're defined by the GHG protocol. You wouldn't expect anyone to extend them. Great. Then you've got base taxonomy stub domain, so targets. Targets are all entity defined in ISSB. ESRS, it has some built-in targets, but it also lets you define your own. So for the ones you're defining yourself, it has to just be empty and say, put them in here. Same with subsidiaries in your company. The taxonomy doesn't know how many subsidiaries you've got, so you leave it empty. And then you've kind of got the hybrid ones down at the bottom there, which is time horizon. So it's an example from ISSB. So they have short-term, medium-term, long-term, but they're all entity defined what that means. So maybe an entity ends up saying it wants a slightly less short time horizon or not quite as long. It can add whatever it wants. Adding them is always problematic because you lose comparison, but you also got to do what the entity wants. And then over on the right, we've got type dimensions, and it's only really that middle row that lines up. A type dimension is just an empty domain. It says, you should tell me your targets. And you put those targets straight into your report. So with a type dimension, the key thing is you don't need an entity extension taxonomy for it. It just goes straight in the report. So where are we using these dimensions? So emissions categories was a good example of a kind of traditional breakdown where people think, okay, you're dividing it into the categories. I want to see how my Scope 3 gases go against all these categories, and you think of a table. But a lot of the time, the dimensions are used to link facts together. So all the facts associated with a particular target, all the facts associated with a particular material topic. And although it's written slightly differently, and I'll walk you through it, Richard had a picture up this morning of it for ESRS. This is basically two parts of how do we group the facts together, say for a material topic or a target, and then how do we relate one to the other. So it's how do you make that link between your metrics and your targets, or your risks and opportunities and your metrics. So start with GRI. It's a very lightweight approach. They have material topics, which is a type dimension. So that's for the entities to say these are the, so an entity always defines what is a material topic in GRI, and obviously that it's material. And then for each of those, you say which standards are applying from the list in GRI. So that is the link, if you like, between I think this is my topic, and these are the applicable disclosures for this topic. And then with ISSB, you have targets and metrics as entity-defined areas. So there's a lot of built-in metrics in ISSB, and then you can define your own entity-specific metrics. Say you've got an intensity ratio or something like that you want to capture. And then they've also got their risks and opportunities, and they have a related metric. So you end up, the risk and opportunity doesn't directly connect to the target, but they both connect to the metric, and you work through like that. ESRS is the same, but bigger. So you have a few extra of these subdomains that you can define your own things in here. And we don't need to dwell on it. I quite like Richard's diagram, so hopefully that slide will be useful for people. But basically, think about which direction things are going in is the key point. It's not necessarily that you can, so a metric has a related IRO, and IRO doesn't have a related metric. Actions and targets do relate to each other, so they go both ways. So if we skip ahead, and I'm going to turn to some examples, but the key thing to bear in mind is you use a dimension to group all the facts to do with the target, and then you use an extensible enumeration to link your target, for example, to your policy, or your metrics to your opportunity, and so on. And so it's the same mechanism technically being used in all three standards, even if they're slightly differently arranged because of what the standard wants and does. So I'm going to skip over these, but they are all in the taxonomies, there, and there. So we've got some nice targets. These are some I made earlier. Who wouldn't want to reduce their direct energy usage? And so that's got a nice target dimension there. This is an explicit. And you can say it's absolute. Great. You can say base year, all those things. Now we've got related policy. And that fact value is different. So the human readable text says policy 001, and the fact value there says car policy 1. And the reason it does is because it's using the policies which are up here. So the policy has been, the dimension has been named car policy 1 for this particular policy, and that is exactly that domain member that's being used there. So you end up with this hard link. It's not a guess. It's not the text happens to be the same. It's literally pointing at the same thing. So that combination of a dimension and an extensible enumeration to link two different areas of the taxonomy together. And for those that are worried, it is exactly the same with a typed axis. Okay, you have your target defined like this, except you've put your target in the report. But this time, extensible enumerations only work with explicit dimensions, so you have to do it with a text identifier, but it's the same text as used for the policy dimension up there. And then you think, well, how do we check those? Because extensible enumerations give it us for free. Well, with type dimensions, you use a formula rule, and that's what Richard's done in ESRS to line these two up. So same approach with both things, same output when you look at it here. There are two policies linked together. So that's an area where there are both similarities and differences. Next one is materiality. So let me flick back to the slides. So materiality and emission. Now, news just in from Piers, he's changing it, but I prepared this earlier. So implicit in all of them is if you report something, it is assumed to be material. Kind of guess we should call that out, but there we are. ISSB is really simple. If you don't think it's material, don't report it. Do whatever you want. GRI has two nice tables, one to capture whether something's material or not, and one to capture whether you've omitted it or not. And ESRS does it slightly differently. It's still a table, but so normally you report a fact, and that is great. If you report something in XBRL called a nil fact, that means I'm literally telling you I'm not reporting this. Well, what's the difference between that and not reporting it? Well, if you just don't report it, we don't know whether you just didn't report it by accident. You just forgot about it. Whereas when you report a nil fact, you say, I really am choosing not to report this, so it's capturing that positive choice. So they are, again, very similar mechanisms, but slightly different mechanisms. So we'll just see them in the taxonomy briefly, so you've seen them. Not those. Oh, yes, more examples. Skip them. So there's an emissions table here where, so basically you write your reason as your line item, and then you use, on the dimension, you use the member it's talking about for GRI. Whereas for ESRS, as I say, you report in the item as normal, but setting it to nil, and then you use this reason, which I'm struggling down here. So you have a reason here that you say it's not applicable, not material, or not stated. So you use a dimension to tell the reason you are not reporting it. So that's been encoded in a dimension with ESRS, whereas you write it as a text field in GRI. But either way, the reason is linked to the data point. Okay, categorical variables. I said we'd come on to them. So Booleans, true, false, I think everyone gets them. They're best as statements. Gender pay gap reduced since last year, one of my favorites. You can have 6 pages of consultantese, but, and you may or may not know whether the gender pay gap reduced reading it, but if this thing says it's true or false, then you have an immediate and actionable answer. Target revised since last year, that's also an indication you should go and look why the target changed, and then you can think of all sorts of examples. Extensible enumerations are about saying there's a choice that's different to true, false, so it could be your target type is an intensity target or an absolute target, so that's still 2 choices, but it's between A and B rather than true and false. And sometimes you want to be able to choose a set value. So just to make it really clear, if we had to find our favorite publishing media for sustainability data, your base taxonomy would have a list of things, and you could choose from them, which we've done. We've said inline XBRL is our most popular report format. But we could also extend it, and that's where the extensible comes in. You could put your own additional item on there. And again, that mechanism of extending an enumeration is used in at least 2 of the sustainability taxonomies to say, well, I want to, so if there's a list of metrics, I want to add my own metric in there. So it's just being aware of this mechanism, that it exists and why. And I'll show an example on that along with intensity measures. So hopefully everyone's seen intensity measures now. They are entity defined for ISSB, as in there's nothing in the taxonomy, but there's things you can do to create one, but you're not going to be asked for one. ESRS actually asks you for certain ones that are defined in the standard, and GRI lets you report, but again, they're entity defined. So when they're entity defined, they really could be anything. Tons of emissions per employee would be an odd one, because you'd start thinking how many employees you should hire or fire to fix your number. But emissions per net revenue is a standard ESRS one, or total water consumption per net revenue. I think there's a standard energy one in ESRS as well. So again, as examples, these are all heavily used, categorical elements and intensity measures, even if they're entity defined, are used in all 3. There we go. So there we are. I made some GRI emissions table. So you get tons of CO2e, and your human readable text says, so if you can read it, what gases are included, and it's carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, and the human's written something, and the tag text is again using these taxonomy elements, which is why it says member after it, things like that. So if someone wants to write a query for analysis, they can query for show me all the filings where it features these two or one of these, and there's no text matching. You are directly matching something from the taxonomy, so it will always work correctly. Come back. So baselines, milestones, and targets. All things you'd kind of associate. Where are we starting from? How are we getting there? And what's the finish line? ESRS, they are all there, all quantitative, the year itself, the value in that year. ISSB does have, like the target, it doesn't really do milestones. It has a baseline year concept for all targets. GRI has certain standards within it, capture start and end dates. So I guess the thing to take away is they're there and captured to different levels in all of them. That means data doesn't necessarily always flow between them, but they're all trying to capture the same thing, but again, it's not a taxonomy thing, it's what the standard is capturing. So what improvements could we make? My target has changed. Well, they all have text blocks to capture that. ISSB has a nice boolean too, saying something changed. So you know something's changed, but which bit changed? Did someone move their baseline to fiddle things? Did they make their target more, hopefully, more ambitious? So again, you could think, well, we could have more structured stuff there as well as just the text block. Working in all regulatory environments, so those that want entity extension taxonomies, those without, that's a good one for everyone to think about, whether it's reasonable to support that, how one might support that. Aligning the technical approach where possible. Sometimes the standards are really doing different things. Sometimes, we had an example of this with emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. Do you have that as a dimension or a line item? And ESRS and ISSB internally at one point were doing different things, and they just went, well, we'll just all agree we can just have line items. We'll see what GRI does. So another improvement, which a lot of people have asked about, is digital concordance. So that's going to help information flow between standards and help preparers and users. That is something that would require new specifications and work, and so we'll watch this space. When we have news on that, we'll tell you. But that is how you use the fact there's actually quite a lot of technical alignment between these taxonomies to then let information flow between them. So we're not trying to say everything translates, and we might be saying this thing definitely doesn't translate, but if you can take 80% of the information across from one filing to the other, excuse me, from one sustainability taxonomy to the other, then that means if you're looking at a pile of ISSB sustainability reports, and you really want to bring in this company that's done an ESRS report, you can probably get some value automatically there as a user. So that's the important thing. So some of these things I've been talking through, and John referred to this morning, led us to put out this consultation on sustainability report creation software. So it's building on the existing certification program, which is a lot more focused on specification conformance, whereas this new one is about saying, can the software create the right tags? So there's no reason the software can't, but it's going to give confidence to all stakeholders if they know that if it's got the badge, it can work with all these sustainability taxonomies that are all using entirely standard mechanisms, but we need to be able to say to the market, this software can create these. So my concluding remarks. Sustainability reporting taxonomies are using mature XBRL technology. They are very polished and usable compared to the early versions of other taxonomies, particularly the financial taxonomies. And one of the good reasons for that is they're benefiting from all the existing best practice, guidance, and taxonomy software out there already. There are definitely things that can be improved in sustainability taxonomies. That is as it should be. Taxonomies and digital reporting are iterative processes and really happy feedback loops. So if you hear concerns about typed or explicit dimensions or enumerations instead of text, now you know, they all work just fine. Digital sustainability reporting is here. Please do spread the good news.
Thank you very much, Stu. There's sure to be a question or two, yes? Good. First. 2 questions at least. Make them hard.
Thank you. So, Marc Coulier from Corporate Things. There's one thing that we see currently in reports, the reports, that's, for instance, data that is incomplete, that the company was not able to get all the data because they consolidated a company that doesn't have all the data. Another thing we get in reports is data that was just taken from benchmarks. It's not a measure, it's just an approximation, for instance. And it's really important for us as users to get that specific information, that the data is not complete, or an approximation. For instance, if we want to make a benchmark from data we collect, we don't want to include data that was itself made for benchmarks. And we found out that it was difficult to make that into taxonomies because you don't want to use a dimension for that. You don't want to exclude information. You'd like to have something like an attribute that you just put on the fact. And I'd like to know if there's any work done on that or planned to make that sort of information available in XBRL.
Yes. Attributes. Attributes are a thing that in some ways were missed out of XBRL. So dimensions put things into columns, attributes just are like an annotation. So in some ways the extensible enumerations can act as an attribute. That's one of the things, but for what you're talking about, it can be quite awkward. So whether things have been estimated is another, like you were saying, or from benchmark data. So yes, there is ongoing thought. One of the mechanisms people are using, and actually SRS refers to, is these fact-to-fact links. So you have a descriptive fact that says, we've used the following benchmark information, and then you can put a digital link from that to all the associated facts that have used that, and that then allows an analyst software to process them, and as you say, exclude them. So that's the kind of go-to thing, but I always think there's opportunities for doing better with it. Like, can we make it easier to use? So yeah, I'm very happy to have more conversations about that.
Maybe something more standard so that anybody who creates a taxonomy knows that this is what they are supposed to do, right?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, so there's a standard link called explanatory fact, which no one knows what it means. It explains something, and you're right, coming up with a set of standardized ones that are common enough to be useful, not just specific to a particular taxonomy, will really help. Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Next, yes.
Thank you for the explanation, and it's nice to see all the 3 taxonomies combined in a presentation. And we talked today about the scenario to have a company that have a report, one document, and then is facing to have 3 different taxonomies. How can we facilitate the work of the users on the tagging, having these 3 different scenarios of taxonomies? Is there any idea that you can?
For the users who might have to report against all 3?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've been having some fun experiments with multi-tagging. I can show you some examples afterwards if you want. By fun, I mean where the 3 standards don't overlap, it's really easy to tag because you're just thinking about one. But when you've got to tag scope 3 emissions using 3 different ways, you can do it and it goes in the document fine, but it's really quite scrambling for me as a human to get my head around it, because you've just about worked out how you've tagged it in one, and now you've got to throw that all away and think how they're tagging it in another one. So technically it works, so that's a good start. Technically you can multi-tag, absolutely. Happy to show you an example. But I think it's, again, one of the things that digital concordance will help with. So the bits that can be most difficult to tag is when you've got dimensions on those quantitative numbers and you're kind of trying to wrestle with it. But that's also should hopefully be a really good fit for digital concordance. So I've tagged against one of the standards. Can the concordance just do the tagging for the other two? I'll still have to check it. It's still my responsibility, not the machine's, but the concordance can make those links for me. So I'm not there wrestling with it. The boring bit's been done, the tagging, and I'm just reviewing it. So I hope that will help with that, yeah. But it's not a bad situation already, I suppose is my headline point.
I think once we have the first reports with the data, we will see how challenging it is.
Yes.
And I think the key is to communicate between the different taxonomy authors and to kind of go in the same direction on the tagging and on the
concordance.
how the taxonomy is built. I think that's something that could help the users to facilitate the tagging process. And of course, all the work had been done in interoperability and have like a official list of which elements are overlapping, and then the communication is really clear, and we can say the users use this, and this will be, you don't need to tag twice because it's already in the other taxonomy, right? And then just, I think this is just call of doing that more, the communication between the authorities or the taxonomy authors, and then clear information for everyone. I think it's the key.
Key points, and yeah, let's not forget there's a policy side here that's way over there from where I am, which is why are we making people tag 3 times? You know, maybe you need to, maybe you shouldn't, maybe you should make them tag this bit, but not the whole report. That's a great way to simplify that process without any technological fix. But yeah, when you're talking about the interoperability and a list of elements and how they go across, that's exactly what the digital concordance work will hopefully do. Yeah.
Any more questions for Stu? One here, Shraddha.
Sorry, Charlotte.
I think just to add on to the interoperability thing, right? I just wanted to seek your advice. Like, we are discussing 3 standards and the interoperability piece that will be coming in. Do you see a challenge in the interoperability space between the standards? Like, how do we, sync those 3 together? Will there be a mapping that will be created, or will there be a taxonomy altogether that will create, and it will be simpler for the issuers? Because I think that is something which we need to think through, or
So interoperability is interesting at a standards level, as in the sustainability standards. My words, not theirs. You can say it's interoperable, but it's only when you try and join the digital bits together you discover whether it's actually interoperable and how it is interoperable. And it's mostly interoperable except for that bit. And so doing that digital work, yes, helps preparers, yes, helps users for sure, but it also helps the standard setters, because where they think it's 100% interoperable, they've then got a machine-readable document that can be human-readable as well, saying, yeah, those bits are. Those bits are only interoperable when you're standing on one leg, right? So, yeah, the more we capture those changes in a way that everyone agrees are correct, then I think it will help not just the preparers and the users, but the standard setters on an ongoing basis, going, well, do we need these to be different? Maybe we do.